Okay, Erev Tov to all. It's really special to see so many of you this evening. Addiction is not limited to drugs, alcohol, or gambling. Some people eat compulsively, others shop or order online beyond their budget. Others can't stop working or even exercising. And we can all benefit from learning more about addiction and compulsive behavior. We cannot and must not brush addiction under the carpet. We all owe those struggling with addiction or in recovery to build a community of sensitivity, warmth, and support. February, as many of you know, is a month that on an annual basis is devoted nationally to raising awareness of mental illness. And here at Young Israel, we have always devoted this month to education on these topics. And this month alone, we've had a series on mindfulness. Last week, we had a presentation on depression and anxiety. And tonight, we are going to be learning about substance abuse. And I want to specifically thank the Ruderman family for their partnership and for sponsoring this important series, which we have titled Learning from and Leaning on One Another. And that's because all of these classes have been taught by our own members here at Young Israel who have so much wisdom and knowledge to offer. Tonight's presentation by Ruby Yarmush is going to be dedicated to the memory of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky, Zichrono Livracha, tzaddik, who many of us knew personally or knew of, a Talmid Chacham, a psychiatrist, a clinician, a mentor, who was a trailblazer in the world of addiction, writing countless books on the Torah of the 12 steps and about addiction. And I had the personal privilege of seeing him in action during my internship at JACS, Jewish Alcoholics and Chemically Dependent People and Significant Others. And so our learning tonight and our growth tonight should serve as an aliyah for his neshama. And now just a brief word of Torah before handing the virtual mic over to Ruby. In Parshat Bechukotai, there is a brief introduction to the bracha, the Im Bechukotai Telechu, if you do good, you will get good. But there is a long introduction to the Klala. People who despise the ways of Hashem, reject the system of mitzvot, who cast aside the brit, the covenant. And the Seforno points out that these four stages are progressive, meaning that one leads to the next. Rabbi Yehuda Brandis, in his Sefer on the Parsha, calls this the gradual descent into a life that we never planned on living. The natural world automatically pulls us in a downwards direction. Raw materials inevitably decompose, dust accumulates in the corners of our living rooms. And in order to resist this natural force or inertia, we must constantly remain on the move. When I was training to be a rabbi, as I mentioned, I did this internship with JACS. And when I was in the rooms listening to stories, witnessing Rabbi Twersky work his magic, I remember hearing a metaphor that he once shared about recovery. He said, imagine your addiction as an escalator that is constantly moving downwards. If you don't move your feet and start walking upward, the rolling staircase will take you lower into the depths of your illness. The moving steps are always downwards. You must walk, sometimes run up the steps just to remain in place. Otherwise, the addiction escalator brings you down once again. I think this metaphor is relevant to all of us, and especially during this difficult, tumultuous time of the pandemic. Being idle often means moving backwards. Moving forward very slowly means staying in the same place. And a healthy pace means moving forward and upward. Living life requires the constant motion, the constant choosing the right choice, and that's hard work. And to help us with that hard work, to be our guide tonight, it's really a pleasure and privilege to introduce our Gabbai Rishon, who does so much for the shul behind the scenes in organizing us around the bima, and has gone above and beyond, especially during the COVID world order, to keep our community safe. Ruby also serves on our COVID task force and always has such valuable insights to offer the team for all of our protocol. As many of you know, Ruby serves as a mental health counselor at Clark University. He has a master's degree in psychology, and he's a generalist who has many areas of interest, from mindfulness, depression, anxiety, substance use, and transition to adulthood. He has been a teacher and a therapist across our community for over 7 years, and it's really a special treat for us to invite him to teach us this evening. So without further ado, Ruby, you can unmute, and now the virtual mic is actually yours.
Thank you, Rabbi Chesses. The audio cut out a little at the end, so I'm sure that was all the honest things you were actually saying about me, as opposed to the other embellishments beforehand. But I'd like to thank Rabbi Chesses first and foremost for organizing this. I think it's a wonderful initiative, and I'm very flattered that I was asked to share with you tonight. I would also like to give gratitude to the Ruderman Foundation for making this possible. They do a lot of fantastic and important work around the Boston Jewish community. Am I coming in clear? Okay, good. I'd like to thank you all for staying home tonight and tuning in to this. And of course, I would be remiss without mentioning the passing of Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twersky Zatzal, who really he was Freud for Jewish people struggling with substance. He was the one and only, that no one else really kind of did what he did and made a mark on that part of our community the way he did. So it's a big loss for us. And the Gemara says that the loss of one Jewish soul is like losing an entire world. And for people who have personal connections to those who pass on, you can feel it. It's harder to feel people that you don't know as well, but for someone like him, it's not. Okay, so let's get started. So we're talking tonight about substance use and addiction, which, like Rabbi Chesses mentioned correctly, are not always the same thing, and how that relates to our Jewish community. So first is just a simple definition. What is addiction? Right? What are we talking about here? So there's a lot of ways to try and define addiction, none of which typically are really satisfactory enough, but there's the biological model. We have the idea that if you use a substance, right, let's say, and you continue using it, your brain chemistry and your body physiology will adapt to the point where if you don't continue using it, you will start to feel sick, right? These are called withdrawal symptoms. They can call this chemical dependence, right? And we see this with a lot of different substances, and this is a simple biological definition for it. However, the one problem with that is that once someone has been able to pass whatever chemical it was through their body, whether it's through detox at a facility or on their own, we still see many people going back to the same substance, to the same source of whatever it is that was plaguing them from before. So the biological model leaves a tremendous amount to be desired. Second definition could be a mental health perspective. I can share my screen and I'll put a slide up. Okay, let me see if I can get it into the full screen. There we go. Right, so if you exhibit cravings, If you feel like it's getting in the way and you want to stop, but you cannot, right? Having the inability to limit the amount that you're taking, or really struggling to do so, right? Starting to have trouble fulfilling the different regular obligations or activities you like or need to do, seeing problems in your relationships. And then ultimately, if you're using any kind of these substances or engaging in these behaviors in a way that puts you in danger and you continue to do so, that's how in the mental health world we can diagnose you with what we call a substance use disorder, or if it's a different type of thing like gambling or shopping, we can diagnose you with that. So that's an example of the mental health one. The problem with that is, um, not unlike the detox, we continue to kind of fail to address these issues. That we see some progress. A person can not do this for extended periods of time, years, right, months, years, decades, and then can relapse right back into it, and it can come back just as quickly as it did beforehand with major gaps. So, also leaves a lot to be desired. So we really struggle defining this, right? And depending on who you're talking to, depending on which professional, depending on which person at the AA or Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous meeting, they might tell you something entirely different. And in working with so many different clients of mine that have struggled with addiction and substance use and other compulsive behaviors, it, they don't all necessarily hear the same thing, and they don't I can explain something one way to them and it won't make sense. It won't work within their narrative. So this is really a major struggle in the industry, and I think we continue to struggle. I will a little bit later share a couple of better definitions that I feel better encapsulated, but you'll see why there's just a little bit of difficulty. So generally, again speaking, addiction has been prevalent for a very, very, very long time. We don't have good historical records of how far back addiction really goes, but no better example would be 19th century China with the opium epidemic. Opium has been used by humans for thousands of years. The oldest poppy plant that was discovered was, I think, 6,000 years old, and that's what we've found on record. So it's been around as long as civilization has been around, that's for sure. And why the opium epidemic is interesting, at least for many of us who if we're not in the Boston area, have connections to the Boston area, is in 19th century Boston was built on the opium cartels by the names of Forbes, Delano, as in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Perkins, if people are familiar with the Perkins School for the Blind, people who made their money in the tea industry. The tea industry was really a laundering front for their opium trade, that where they smuggled opium into China through passing the naval blockade. They had special small ships with rowers that would row the opium in, and they would control it, and then from the money made from the drug trade there, they would transfer that to tea and bring that to the New World. So we've all, in some indirect way, benefited from that, and it's been around for a very long time. We're talking a few hundred years already, at least. So it's plagued us, and we've known about it. We've medicine has come so far with so much disease, right? I didn't even bring up the disease model, right? We call this an illness very often. We call it a disease, addiction. It's certainly an affliction for those that experience it, but we've come so far with curing and treating so much disease. If this was simply just a disease, we probably would be doing a lot better than we are now. So it's not just simply a biological disease, most likely. Not that it's not helpful to name it that way, and I will touch upon that again later. So in the United States, as of 2017, we do have some statistics that are a little more recent, but as of 2017, approximately 20 million US adults struggled with addiction and substance abuse, specifically substance abuse. We're not even talking about some of the other types of addiction. It's a lot of people, right? And that statistic is not taken solely from legal adults. That when they say adults in these studies, they're talking about from ages 12 and older. which is an astounding thing to consider. In fact, many of my clients that I speak to, when I just talk to them about how they first started using a substance, how they first started getting into a compulsive behavior, the ages that they quote to me are typically not 25, 26, 35, 36. They say 16, 15, 14, 13. I even had a client I remember telling me that he started drinking regularly at 7 years old. And that's a reality this starts very, very early for some people, and it's a complicated process that way. So what do we have? We have a few questions. So just very quickly, sorry to get sidetracked, but if anyone would like to submit questions directly to me, if you open up the chat, or Rabbi Chessis, you can do so anonymously if you don't feel comfortable submitting them, for the entire group to read. I will check in on the chat and um, answer questions as we go. And in addition to that, because we're on Zoom and I'm now talking inside of all of your homes, some of this stuff may be a little difficult for kids to hear. So please use your discretion with whoever can kind of eavesdrop on the conversation. Okay, back to where we are. So what do we do about this? If we're talking just substance use, how do we treat this? How do we help these people? So there's different levels of treatment that we provide as a society. First one is detox. If you are using a substance and you are chemically dependent, you're having withdrawals from it, you need to get off of it. We have detox facilities that it typically takes about a week. That's about how long it is. They now offer you a lot of comfort medications to make sure that the process will be as painless as it can be. You probably don't remember much of it throughout the process, and then after a week, you leave from there. So what's very interesting about detox is that you only qualify to go to a place like that is if you are addicted to a substance that does create withdrawal symptoms, that does create chemical dependence. So, for example, if you struggled with using cocaine, which does not create any real withdrawal symptoms, they would not admit you to detox. Whether you needed a week with medical attention, with psychological support, if you needed that, you can't go to detox. And in addition to that, if you don't have drugs in your system, they won't admit you in detox. If you have had a year of sobriety and you're struggling and you cannot stop yourself and you know you're going to end up using, you can't walk into a detox and be admitted. They won't allow you there. And I've had many clients in the past who will intentionally relapse because they know they're safer if they relapse and go to detox, or they hope they're safer if they relapse and go to detox than if they were to try to continue their sobriety at that point. So that's one allusion to the difficulty that we have with our societal approach to treating people like this. The next level of care, hopefully, that you would get to out of detox is an inpatient facility. Inpatient treatment, typically what we call dual diagnosis. So most inpatient treatment that treats substance use also treats mental health mental illness, and whether one precedes the other, typically it's now referred to as co-occurring diagnoses as opposed to dual diagnosis. You usually find one with the other. It's very hard to really develop an addiction to a substance and come out on the other end unscathed. It's very unlikely. It really will affect your mind and your body to the extent where you're going to have struggles. And even for those that are able to kind of heal on a quicker basis than the average person, the immediate after effects, anxiety, depression, are assumed that they're built in. So if you make it, if your insurance covers it, right, or if you're very fortunate and you're financially able to put yourself into a treatment center like this, you do inpatient treatment. Then if you are able to continue progressing, you would go to something called a partial program, where you might stay at home, whereas inpatient you would sleep in the facility. You might stay at home, and then during the day you would attend different groups. You would meet with your psychiatrist, you would meet with your individual counselor or therapist, and then you would graduate from that program. We also have something very similar that we call IOP, which is intensive outpatient, where again, you would be living at home and you would go for a few hours a day, maybe 5 days a week, 3 days a week, depending on the facility and the treatment model. And all along, the ideal is to kind of step a person down slowly so they have proper support when they need it, and slowly foster independence to the point where they can now start re-engaging with their lives and society. Um, and then after that, most people have two choices. They have outpatient therapy, where they would meet with someone like me, and we would go through regular long-term therapy. Anyone that qualifies with a substance use disorder, I know at least in Massachusetts, qualifies pretty much for coverage, regardless of what the insurance is. Um, we designate short-term recovery as up to 1 year. So if you have 355 days of sobriety under your belt, you're still only in short-term recovery, technically speaking, and that's what the insurance will use as the technical stuff. And on the flip side to that, which is not mutually exclusive, you can do both outpatient therapy and Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, but they're the 12-step programs. And that's pretty much where we are with addiction, right? It's there in America. We have treatment models. There are still plenty of cracks and loopholes that people fall through, and a lot of clients that I worked with like to refer to the spin cycle, where they go through all of those steps, and then they relapse and they go through all the steps again, and then they relapse and they go through all the steps again. And the prevailing notion among the research world is that the average substance addict will relapse 7 times in their lifetime. Now, if I say that to a group of people who are in a recovery group, some people will look at me in terror and think, I have to do this 6 more times, right? That's unfathomable. This has been horrible. I can't imagine going through this 6 more times and surviving to tell the tale. And the person sitting next to them will look at them and chuckle and say, that was last month, right? And they've relapsed hundreds of times in their lifetime. So there's really a very broad spectrum of what this is, how it affects people. I know Noah asked the question, are there any addictions that are hereditary? The truth of the matter is we don't know. The genetics are not there yet. The research is not there yet. The answer is probably not in a way that we can point to like an eye color type of gene, where we say you have the alcohol addiction gene or the opiate addiction gene. Probably not. But if you're talking about something like epigenetics, where you might have some built-in genes that, given the right—
What's that word? Say it again.
Epigenetics. Right. So we didn't cover this with Dr. Halpern in 10th grade bio at Maimonides, unfortunately. So you have essentially dormant genes that, given the right exposure to circumstances, stress, other kind of factors, could then produce a gene that would make you more susceptible to that. We certainly see a hereditary link as far as anecdotally, right? You see that with families, but it's very hard to really kind of differentiate between nature and nurture at that point. And I don't think there are any really rock solid studies that can point to that. I mean, if you talk to a geneticist, they'll probably lean towards, wanting to believe that the genetics are really the driving force. And if you talk to a therapist like me, I'll probably tell you that it's probably the environment and the family structure and those types of things. So it depends a lot on who you're asking. But it's a very good question. But if you know that your father or your grandfather or your uncle or your aunt or your cousins or your siblings are struggling, then you may be wise to just be careful, right, at that point. And that's usually a discussion I have with a lot of people. It certainly seems to travel in packs that way. So the question is, right, so it sounds like this is a pretty robust system, right? We have all these different levels of care. We have insurance companies that will pay for this. We've known about addiction for so long. Why do we still stink at making this better, right? Why aren't people getting the help they need? This is a very important question that we deal with. So one reason is society's approach thus far, right? For the last 170 years, the sole proprietor of, no pun intended, policing drug use and addiction in the United States has been the Department of Justice, right? We fill jail cells upon jail cells with all sorts of people who are struggling with addiction. They go through horrible withdrawals and experiences in jail, right? And then, as I'm sure my father-in-law can tell you, are not necessarily cut off from those substances just because they're behind bars and people are trying to be careful about what's brought in and brought out. And I'm not telling you that my father-in-law ever smuggled drugs into jail. That's not what I mean. But there are plenty of my clients whose stories I probably can't tell, but who perpetuated or developed addiction in jail, that were not exposed to drugs outside of jail and developed it once they were in jail. And the Department of Justice just they did a bad job all around. And I don't want to get too far down that road because that can be an entire another hour. Next, our wonderful First Lady from the 80s, Nancy Reagan, with her war on drugs. It's not just justice anymore. We're at war with it. We're at war on drugs, and anyone who's engaging in drugs is the enemy, right? So that's one issue, which I again will get to a little bit later, and we'll see exactly why that in and of itself made it worse rather than started solving the problem. And we probably didn't see this as much in Jewish schools, but for anyone who has experienced a program like DARE, which was very popular in the 80s and 90s, these were programs that would post pictures that looked like this. Where are we? Okay, here we go. Am I sharing it? Oop, that's not the right one. So this is a picture, right? They would show you a picture of an egg, a whole egg, and then they'd show you a picture of a frying pan with an egg in it and say, this is your brain on drugs. They'd say the whole egg is your brain, and your brain on drugs is this. So for those of us who remember adolescence, for those of us who remember our children as adolescents or are currently experiencing our children in adolescence, you remember how enlightening that metaphor must be, to see an egg in a frying pan and just understand all of it, all of this complicated, horrible, addiction issues. It can be explained by a frying pan and an egg. It makes perfect sense. I don't know who screened this, who came up with this, which professionals were involved, but this is the poorest lesson plan I have ever seen. Because the truth of the matter is, I don't think if I took a poll here or if I stopped a random person on the street and I asked them if drugs are good for you, that they would say yes to me, whether they knew much about drugs or not, whether they knew much about addiction or not. No one would say yes, right? Yet we have 20 million people. Are 20 million people under some spell that they're not aware of what the ramifications of drugs are? I mean, if you were still with me for the slide about the mental health criteria for diagnosing substance use disorders, it's if you're doing it despite the fact that you know it's going to harm you, or you know you're putting yourself at harm. So if it's just understanding how bad drugs are for you, then we should have solved this problem decades ago. We shouldn't be talking about 20 million people who were addicted to drugs in the 1990 in 2017, excuse me. So we failed to police it, we failed to approach it from a federal level, and we failed to educate about it, right? So there's no amount of treatment that can stop, misinformation, that can stop improper structure from a societal level. And so the one place that all of these programs and even a lot of these treatment centers can really miss the boat on is the one question you really want to be asking people, especially young people, right? Which is not, why are drugs bad for you? It's, why would anyone want to do it, right? Why do they want it? Why would they choose to do it, right? If they did it once, why would they choose to do it again? If they did it many, many times and now they can't get off of it, right? Why would they choose to do it again, right? If it's causing such trouble, why would they choose to do it again? So this is really where, which is, this is the money question right here. So there is a famous psychiatrist who I would say is probably the Rabbi Twersky of the greater addiction world. Was actually Jewish himself. He was born in, oops, where did this go? Let me get back to that share screen. Okay, here we go. So nope, here we go. He was born in a in a refugee camp in, I think, Budapest during the end of the Holocaust. Um, and then his family immigrated to Canada, and he became a psychiatrist and was one of the pioneering psychiatrists in what was called Downtown East Side, which was a special designated area in Vancouver where they were experimentally testing out clean injection sites. These guys were the first ones to do it, and so Gabor Mate was one of the pioneers there, and his conceptualization of addiction is probably as good as anyone's I've come across. So I don't even I don't love reading off of slides, but I can't say this better than he writes it. So he writes, addiction is a complex psychophysiological process. Just describing it that way is a much better way of describing it. You call it an illness, you think physiological, right? You call it a mental illness, you think it's psychological, but it's really a psychophysiological process. It's both. But it has a few key components, he says. I'd say that an addiction manifests in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in and therefore craves. So for all of my wonderful family that joined me tonight, Uncle Jody would ask me if I drink coffee, and I would say yes, and he would say, well, you're a drug addict then too, right? And I don't think Dunkin' Donuts wants people talking about coffee that way. I don't think Starbucks wants people talking about coffee that way. But in Gabor Mate's definition, even something like coffee, even something less than coffee that just provides relief or pleasure, and therefore you crave, suffers negative consequences from, and has trouble giving up, right? So the rabbi, I'm sure, can attest that the week before Yom Kippur, there are 1,001 caffeine-related questions and jokes that go flying around before a major fast day. That everyone who drinks coffee on a daily basis is going to struggle. So that fits that definition. So he says there's craving, relief, and pleasure in the short term and negative outcomes in the long term, along with an ability to give it up. So that's one part of the definition. There's craving, relief, and pleasure. So if we just take away the craving and we ask, why do people use drugs? Why do people spend money when they know they don't have it? Why do people eat those extra helpings of food without being hungry, knowing that they don't need to eat it, right? Because it provides relief and pleasure. No one tells a teenager that. No one tells somebody the reason why people do drugs is because at some point, and probably at the beginning, it might feel really, really good. It might even feel better than good. It might feel amazing. It might feel like something that a person has never experienced before and cannot continue to experience without that drug. In McLean right now, they are researching the effects of psychedelics on depression as a long-term medical treatment. And it's has some promising basis to it, but they tried that in the 70s and it didn't work because it's hard to replace what a psychedelic drug will give to you. It's very, very hard, and a sober life doesn't really represent what a psychedelic trip represents. So that's what an addiction is, he says. He says, note that this definition says nothing about substances, right? While addiction is often connected to substances, it could be anything. It could be religion, it could be sex, it could be gambling, shopping, eating, the internet, relationships, work, extreme sports, right? You've heard the term adrenaline junkies, right? These are people that will literally put their life at risk for the sake of a rush, they call it, right? They have to step it up one more time. If you watch any of those programs, right? They started with skydiving, then it's base jumping where they're jumping off buildings, they're jumping off cliffs, then they're base jumping without a parachute on. They throw the parachute out the plane first and then they jump after the parachute, right? I don't think anyone can argue that it's a very safe activity, right? So what's the point of doing that? It's because it gives them the type of feeling that they can't find anywhere else in life. So the issue with this, he says, is not the external activity, but the internal relationship to it. Thus, one person's passion is another's addiction. So I think the most important word here out of this entire definition is relationship. So I'm going to speak a little more about that. For most people who struggle with something that is an addiction, giving it up doesn't simply represent walking away from a behavior, right? It doesn't simply represent walking away from a relief valve. Yes, a lot of people use drugs for relief. A lot of people use shopping for relief. A lot of people use food for relief. But we still have to eat, and most likely you still have to shop for certain things. These are things that are unavoidable. But there is a dynamic, there's a relationship that people engage with in this activity that takes it into a totally different experience. And it's very hard to part with relationships when you really rely on those relationships. I mean, just watch parents drop their kids off for camp or drop their kids off in the airport on the way to spending their year in yeshiva or seminary, right? The emotions well up, you know, it's such a hard thing, and you know you're only going to miss them for a few months or maybe even most of a year. But that relationship is so strong that it's really hard to even think about parting with them temporarily. So when someone gets involved with a substance or someone gets involved with something that they really can't stop themselves from doing, they've engaged in a relationship. And what's very interesting is if you look at some mental health treatment models that have been effective for addiction treatment of all different kinds, there is a grief and loss component to the therapy that oftentimes an addict will really have to go through a full blown grieving process because they are giving up something that has been so integral to their lives. In fact, sometimes it's the only thing that they can count on. And so, in order to stop this, right, you have to recognize number one, you know, I did it for a reason. What is that reason? I needed relief. I needed pleasure. I needed to feel something different than what I was feeling before. And number two, I'm engaging in a relationship. And the reason why I'm engaging in a relationship that I know is detrimental to myself is because my relationship with whatever I had before with myself was not good enough. In fact, it could have been horrible. And in most cases it is. And especially when you're talking about substances, you're talking about a community where one of my first supervisors said you can walk into an AA meeting and everyone in the room suffered major trauma. Everyone. You can easily just pick a person out and you would have a 99 to 100% chance that that person went through something traumatic in their life, probably repeated trauma in their life. And so when you go through such extreme experiences, right, it changes you to the point where things that for someone who doesn't struggle with substances, we get relief from, you know, a good night's sleep, a day off from work, right? Maybe a massage, maybe, you know, just taking care of ourselves for a little bit, maybe taking some time off to read a book, right? And we can feel a little bit replenished, right? Eating a little healthier. For these people, those things don't bring any relief. They don't bring any pleasure. They are suffering on a constant basis. And the only thing that can help them is something much, much stronger. But we know that comes at a cost. But it's worth it for them. So that's one demographic, right? That's one demographic where we can point to all of those treatment models and all of those social systems that we had in place and understand a little better why it's not working, because these people are suffering day in and day out without this substance. And they're probably continuing to suffer. And if you think about people who are in abusive relationships or in abusive homes, they're struggling even more because they are not free from that abuse. They're not free from the trauma. They're getting repeatedly traumatized and repeatedly traumatized. So there's really nothing that we have that presents a faster and more effective relief than whatever it is they're using for their addiction. So there's a lot of different substances out there. And sometimes we see when you're suffering in certain ways, one thing helps in this way and another thing helps in another way. What you know, very interesting connection is sometimes you see with a manic type bipolar disorder an abuse of cough syrup. I've had a few clients that are addicted to cough syrup, which is a very expensive habit. Um, but that's the only thing that seems to work for them. Some people are looking for depressants, alcohol, opiates, things that bring you down, right? That numb you, that take you away from that pain. And some people can't deal with the fact that they can't do the things they want to do because their pain is so debilitating that they need something to get them up, whether it's cocaine or methamphetamines, right? So sometimes it's what the substance is doing for you, and sometimes it's just the substance is taking you away from wherever you are right now. And it's a very subjective thing, and it's important when dealing with an addiction to help investigate whatever it is or whatever they are, which are the things that are causing you to need something else. A very interesting story. A couple years ago, I was in Israel, and I was catching up with an old friend who teaches in one of the yeshivas, and we hadn't connected in a while, so he asked me what I was up to, and I said I am doing substance use treatment primarily, and he said, "Oh, I need to ask you a question about this one kid we have." This 18-year-old kid from a major New York, New Jersey community shows up in yeshiva with hundreds of tabs of LSD that he created from scratch in his basement at home. So number one, this kid has to win the American Jewish Biochemistry Award for high school students. If he was able to do that, that's very impressive, right? Number two, what in God's name, unless you were planning on selling some of it, would you need that much LSD for? And number three is an 18-year-old kid coming out of a modern Orthodox high school going to a modern Orthodox type yeshiva. What would they need LSD for? What are they going through that being themselves for a day is not worth whatever they're doing, right? The ingenuity that people experience during cravings and addiction is amazing. Some of my clients didn't have a middle school education, let alone a high school education. And when they know that their dealer tells them that you have a half an hour to be at my house or you're not getting anything today, and they know they're 45 minutes away, they will get there in 29 minutes and 30 seconds. It doesn't matter what it takes. They will drive over people's lawns. They will drive on the wrong side of the highway. They will break as many laws as they can. And before they get in the car, they'll throw the bicycle in the trunk just to make sure that just in case if the car breaks down for some reason, they'll have another mode of transportation. But in the meantime, they couldn't get themselves through a middle school. So, it's really, I don't even know if I have time tonight to go into complete depth about how overwhelming this experience is for a lot of these people, but try to get as much as we can. So in regards to this relationship, I think the best way a client ever described to me their experience with opiates was that when I get high on opiates, it just feels like the nicest, kindest, warmest hug I've ever experienced in my life. Right? This person is not trying to do damage. He's not trying to harm anyone, right? He just wants a hug. That's it, right? There's no hug that I can give him or any other human can give him that would really equate to that, but that's really what the goal is. It's a sense of feeling safe. It's a sense of feeling loved. It's a sense of feeling, right, connected to other people, and it's really the relationship with the drugs that keeps people going. I had a client who was on medically assisted treatment. He was on a medication called Suboxone, which is a synthetic opiate itself, but the medication also contains an opiate blocker, so you can't get high. So you are under the influence of opiates. You don't go through withdrawals, but you can't get high. If you could take a pound of heroin and you wouldn't get high from that. And he still relapsed, not because he was craving the drug, because his life was in such shambles at that point that the only stability he knew was to get back together with his user friends and start running, which is what they call it, right? He's running the game. He's back in it, right? There is an entire ecosystem for this person that exists that provides him with some sense of control, some sense of belonging, which he could never generate outside of that. He had such tremendous mental health issues, he couldn't hold down a job. He was having tremendous trouble trying to get disability. His parents were getting elderly and they were getting ill and needed to focus spending their money on themselves. He was older than I am. He was in his, I think he was almost 50, and he was unemployable. He couldn't make any money. He couldn't get any support, and he was falling through the cracks. And the only thing that could help, oh, you know what actually happened? He went to a new psychiatrist who told him he can get him on disability, and he changed his Adderall for a different medication. And the subtle difference from that set him off, and he was unable to regulate himself, and he ended up relapsing just from that. Just a psychiatrist who changed one type of medication to a very similar type of medication. So you can kind of see the fragility of someone like that and what they go through. So it's really about that. And so how does this factor into the Jewish community, right? We have some protective factors. A lot of people fall through these cracks and suffer these pains because they're not connected. Their families are broken. They've never had family, right? They were thrown out of the house. Their families are the ones that are abusing them or introducing them to drugs or doing drugs around them, right? They never provided them with a stable education. They never kept them in an education. I had a client who told me he used to go with his grandfather to parking lots. They had a tow company. He would lift the cars up, steal the catalytic converters out of the car engine, and put the car back down. I think it was maybe at a movie theater, so they knew they had time. And you can drive your car away, and you wouldn't be the wiser until it starts breaking down a few days later. And that's how they paid for their drug habit. That was his grandfather teaching him how to do it, right? And so you don't hear about that as much in the Jewish community here, right? It's not the same, but we struggle. We struggle nonetheless. And so while we have a protective factor of the infrastructure that we do have in place, it's a double-edged sword because uh, we don't see it as much. We're not as familiar with it. We don't know how to pick up the signs. If someone's acting differently, if someone's not fitting in, right? We don't know necessarily how to ask the right questions. Oftentimes, these people don't feel comfortable around the community and they isolate. And the isolation breeds loneliness and detachment and lack of relationship. And so people seek relationship. They need that attachment. You cannot survive without those relationships. So if you don't have them, you turn to something else. So someone, we got a few questions from beforehand. One question was, what about COVID, right? We're hearing all these scary things about substance use, liquor stores just booming during the pandemic. And the answer is, of course, you can order online. You don't even have to go to a liquor store. You could be immunosuppressed. You could be at a very high risk. You can have no support, no structure, no contact with anyone else, but you can buy as much alcohol as you want for a year, right? No one will know, right? And so your drug dealer doesn't care about the mask requirements. He doesn't care about these other things, and so he'll show up at your door if you really want him to, if you pay him enough money, right? The drug trade is not stopping because of COVID. There are plenty of other things that didn't stop because of COVID, certainly not the drug trade, right? Amazon, I hope some people in here have stock in Amazon because Amazon stock is doing very well during COVID, right? You can get whatever you need on Amazon. And for someone who may be struggling financially, right? They need something to attach with. They don't have a person to attach with, so they attach with shopping, and it makes them feel good, and they can bankrupt themselves that way and put themselves in harm's way that way. So it's COVID is definitely making it much harder for these people because they're disconnected. And so while on the one hand in the community we have built-in connections, it's very easy for someone, and if you talk to members of our community who are in recovery, they will tell you, I always felt different. I always felt like I was missing something. I always felt like I didn't belong. Um, Rabbi, ooh, now I'm going to forget his name off the top of my head. From Goldberg, excuse me. I was the rabbi at the Boca Raton Synagogue, a very big community in Boca Raton. Is excellent at being open and welcoming and communicating and teaching about substance use and addiction issues in the Jewish community. And he recently had a live stream with a local clinician who runs a non-for-profit inpatient treatment facility for Jews, from Jews, or really any Jews in the South Florida area. And he had two recovering addicts, two young men. One was probably a little closer to my age, the other one a little younger, and they both said the same thing. I didn't fit in. One of them had gone to the mirror, but he was the kid with the TV at home. So he wasn't worthy. He didn't belong in the mirror, right? He wasn't as frum as the rest of the guys. And that's where it all started. And we've heard that story before, right? We know these people who are a little different or not as frum, or, don't make as much money, or don't do the typical things that fit into the community, and then people fall through the cracks, and so they're left reaching for something else. And in addition to that, because we have, I think in reality, the numbers in the Jewish community are probably lower than the average community, because we don't have a history of dealing with it. Even though we have so many laws and so many halachos and so many rules and so much infrastructure, we really don't have one specifically for this. And that's where Rabbi Tursky came into play with championing the AA movement. He talks about how, if you look at the Rambam's Hilchos Tshuva, the different steps of Tshuva that the Rambam Maimonides puts out, it's almost identical to AA. And he used to tell anyone who questioned any kind of religious issue with attending an AA meeting in a church, or worrying about the Christian undertones or overtones of the doctrine of AA, and he will quote you every Rav Moshe Feinstein Tshuva telling you that absolutely you have to do that. In addition to that, we have built-in alcohol consumption into our ritual lives, which is challenging. What do you do on Pesach, right? You're struggling with alcohol. Your family member, your guest is struggling with alcohol. Are you allowed to drink grape juice? Are you allowed? Is everyone allowed to drink grape juice? Right? Is it just someone that is addicted, or is it everyone? Right? If they're around wine, is it going to be impossible for them to stay safe? And the answer is yes. Everyone can drink grape juice and be Yotze the Daled Kosos, and you do not, if it's not safe for this person, it is a psychonos nefashos issue. You are putting someone in danger, and you are absolutely not allowed to drink wine in this person's presence. I was sitting at my brother-in-law's table when I was in Israel for that trip. It was on a Shabbos, and he had a friend over. And this guy is from Jew in Givat HaMiftar, which is a very, very frum area. And he walks into the house with a bottle of expensive scotch. And he sits down at the dining room table, and we're having lunch, and he pours himself a full 8-ounce cup of scotch. And he drinks the whole thing in one shot. And he pours another full cup of scotch. And I'm sitting across from this guy, just watching him put back 4 or 5 full cups of scotch. And I know, right? Someone else would say, oh, he's probably running the Kiddush club. That may not be an issue. Jews like to drink scotch on Shabbos, especially, the Ashkenazim, right? That's our go-to drink. So he asked me what I do, and I said, I do substance use treatment, and he almost choked on his scotch because he knew that I knew at that point, and he stopped drinking at that point. And I didn't say anything else. I didn't want to, I didn't think it was the time or place, but it's there, and these people don't have someone reaching out saying, hey, you're drinking a lot of scotch, man. Is everything okay? Right. Just asking someone if they're okay, might be the difference for them. It may not be you that helps them, but it might be the difference for them to say, oh, maybe I'm not okay. Maybe I should ask for help, type of thing. So we're starting to get better. There's a wonderful organization based out of Brooklyn that's now in Israel, also called Amudim, which specifically targets substance use, addiction, and abuse in the Haredi community. For the Sharonites, Ari Kafka works for them in Israel and does fantastic, important work for them. The Haredi community struggles even more because it's very hard to find transparency there. And if you're bringing up an issue that runs contrary to the community, you're much more likely to be ostracized than you are to be brought in and supported. So Amudim does a fantastic job of very discreetly getting in contact with these people and getting them the services they need. And there's a lot. It's a growing issue. Just last week, Shayna's cousin, his wife, so through marriage, she lost her brother to an opiate overdose, a young man, and we're hearing it every. If you want to read the news, you'll hear it every week in the Jewish news, that people are struggling out there and they're suffering this way. So I want to get to a couple more of the questions that I didn't get to yet. One question is, does untreated mental illness make you more susceptible to drug dependency? The short answer is probably. That if you're suffering, right, let's say you're depressed and depression has this nasty tendency to make you want to isolate, not let you get out of bed, not let you go to work, not let you engage. And, then you feel terrible because you're not doing all that stuff and it makes depression worse. And then you don't want to get out of bed and you don't want to engage and you don't treat that, you're going to eventually try something. It's going to be very hard to tolerate. So substances might be there, and it might be a way to medicate. And again, with the lack of genetic knowledge, we really don't know if this person or that person is more susceptible if they expose themselves to large amounts of any of these substances or behaviors over a period of time. On the flip side, if you're always anxious, if you can't walk out of the house without worrying and you're constantly, thinking of what can go wrong all day long and you just can't relax, right? If that goes untreated, it's a very hard thing to do. And that's just depression and anxiety, which are the common colds of mental illness. Most people experience depression and anxiety in their lifetimes, even if they're not clinically diagnosed. So if you're talking about other more debilitating mental illness, absolutely it puts you at risk. Another question: are the statistics for substance abuse in the Jewish, are there statistics? The answer is no. We really don't have any good statistics. We don't know. Um, we're starving for a comprehensive study. There's a lot of little pilot studies. Every 5 years there's a pilot study out of Winnipeg, or there's a pilot study out of London, right? And you get this little snippet where, without exception, the end of the abstract of these scientific papers, they say it necessitates further further study, right? And so, yeah, whatever these foundations are, I know we have our own in-house researcher, Michelle Shane. Maybe we can convince her to get on the job. She works for the OU and does a lot of Jewish community research. We need to know about this, right? I know every once in a while in Maimonides, an enterprising senior will say something. We'll do a project where they start handing out questionnaires and asking very personal questions to other students, and oftentimes the school is not at liberty to divulge the results of those studies because some people are not ready to handle that kind of information. So it's in our community as well, and in other communities, it's certainly. I remember one of my very close friends telling me this first time he ever saw a drug was in his high school in Teaneck, where someone was doing cocaine before their sixth period in the locker room. In front of everyone. It wasn't. He wasn't even trying to hide it, and that was a normal thing, for those people. And so it's there. We're just afraid to talk about it. It is a form of denial, but it's also just an experience. We don't see it as much, right? We don't need to handle it as much. We are only starting to come around in our community, being okay with suicide. I saw an interesting tshuva. There's a rabbi who questionable authority out of Beit Shemesh who wrote that a recent major gadol who passed away from COVID in Israel should not be mourned, should not be eulogized, and no one should sit shiva for him, because he specifically said not to get vaccinated. He didn't wear a mask and he died of COVID, and he was a rodef, right? So, not arguing that point. However, someone else said that recently suicide was something where that was an issue, where people asked halachic questions: if someone commits suicide, do we sit shiva for them because they are committing an avera by taking their own life? And so the answer is yes, you sit shiva for them. And yes, we need to talk more about suicide. We need to be more aware of how prevalent it is in our society. We need to be more aware of how many people will have suicidal thoughts and suicidal urges in their lifetime in our community, that are going to shul with us, that are dropping their kids off at school next to us, that are living next door to us. And the same thing with substance use, that, the world has had the ability to sweep this under the rug because it was a criminal issue, right? It was a war. It was always painted as something that was a moral choice, right? These people are choosing to do this when really they're just choosing to try to get relief from whatever they're suffering from. And I didn't even touch on the Sackler family and those contributors to the opiate epidemic currently. So it's a complicated issue, and I think as a society we were behind the 8 ball still, and as a community, the Jewish community, I think we're probably even farther behind the 8 ball, and we have more work to do. I know that when the opiate epidemic in 2016 was starting to become national news, all of the people that were given positions to disseminate any federal funding were medical doctors. And a lot of the treatment programs only included medication. They didn't include any therapy. They didn't include treatment programs. They didn't include AA and all of the other established treatment models that we have, right? So we're still failing at it because we're not doing enough work. We're not doing the right amount of work. We're not diversifying enough. So someone asked, can a person only be helped after hitting rock bottom? So for those who are not familiar, it's definitely a very popular term in the AA and NA communities. That rock bottom usually signifies this point where a recovering addict would have experienced, uh, uh, such a tragic circumstance or circumstances in life that they felt like life could not get any worse than this, and they were then motivated to make the effort and make the changes that they needed to make in order to be in recovery. So the answer is, and I don't. I don't want to argue with this because it's really a very important principle for the AA community, but it might be able to get worse, right? You listen to these stories and they sound really bad, but it could get worse because I've heard someone tell me what their rock bottom is, and I've heard the next person tell me something that's 10 times worse, and they wouldn't even blink at the first person's rock bottom. So there is something that we see, and I don't know that we really know what it is, but there is a change where we can re-engage in our conscious decision making, and so oftentimes it's a point where internally, psychologically, the pain that we cause from continuing to do drugs or engage in our addiction does not outweigh the cost. And people experience that, and that's what I think that this rock bottom experience is like, that they are able to gain some clarity that there's just too much pain, but for a lot of people we know that they don't get there. So there's nothing wrong with not hitting rock bottom. It's okay to still have your job, to still have your family intact, and to get treatment. You don't have to wait for it. There are some problematic issues with AA where it's self-led. It's not led with professionals. It's not led with people who have training. So it depends on who's leading it, and most times it's a fantastic support and it's a fantastic structure for these people. But every once in a while, someone will see a young kid walk in to Narcotics Anonymous and start talking to him and ask him if he's taking Advil, if he has any withdrawal symptoms, or if he's taking Tylenol, or if he takes vitamins, or if he drinks coffee. And this person who says, I have 30 years of sobriety under my belt and I know what I'm talking about, and I'm telling you, you're not sober, you're not clean because you took an ibuprofen this morning. And this one kid who finally got the courage to go to a place for help is only told that he's not doing it right and is rejected again for who knows how many times it's been for this person. So you need to be careful out there. Even if you're seeking treatment, even if you're guiding someone to treatment, you need to be careful with what you're doing because typically these people are very fragile, and it doesn't take much to push them right back to a place where they feel the relationship, the positivity, the pleasure, the relief, the hug, the connection, right? So it's a very difficult thing to kind of navigate that way.
Ruby, a few more questions have come in anonymously.
Okay.
So if I could just share a little bit late, but this has been so enlightening and substantive in a good way. And the question that was posed is about the role that legalizing marijuana has had on substance abuse in and out of the Jewish community. Just does the availability of marijuana have, is it a gateway drug? Are there other sort of, have there been any studies about the effect of that on substance abuse?
So there are studies being conducted now. right? This is a very new thing, so we just don't have the data yet, and we didn't have the COVID warp speed push to get this data out. So that'll take time to figure out how the legalization affected that. But the truth of the matter is, decriminalization came before that, where I don't think we are seeing tremendous increases in people who are using marijuana now that it's legal versus before when it was not technically legal. A lot of people use marijuana already. So they might use it more openly, right? You might walk into a supermarket and your kid will look at you and say, "Is there a skunk in the supermarket?" And you'll say, "Oh, there must be something like that." And then you'll continue walking and stop the conversation because you'll smell it a lot more in different places that you may not have smelled it before. There might be heavier use for people who are using or who want to use. I think that would be one area of concern. Marijuana, as much as we'd like to continue saying it's not an addictive drug, it is an addictive drug, not in a way that is anywhere near as debilitating as some of the other drugs, but it is. And yes, it is a gateway drug that you'd be hard pressed to find someone who has an addiction to cocaine, opiates, methamphetamine, crack, any of that stuff, and have not tried marijuana, have not used marijuana, do not continually use marijuana. So it's there, and legalizing it was. I actually voted to legalize it, and you know, when I'm working with the addicted community, it's a much better alternative. It's not the solution we want, but it is a drug that's not associated with violent crime like alcohol is, which is not only legal, but is promoted and advertised and pushed every which direction that we go in, right? It's much, it does less damage, but nonetheless, we see it's related to psychosis, it's related to anxiety. I have a lot of clients that I work with, and even the college students that smoke marijuana quite heavily. It really does just about the same thing. Where and on the other end of it, you're not going to find success. You're not going to find relief. You're just going to find damage and pain. So I think if your alternative is worse, I can almost recommend it to some people. But if you're not using substances, you know, there is no amount of caution that I can give to not start using marijuana. It's not the miracle drug, right? Willie Nelson is not right on this one. He didn't get it right. It doesn't do that for everybody. Now, if we can extract anti-inflammatory compounds, if we can do it in a way where you're not getting high, that's a different story. You know, that can be very useful, but you know, just smoking marijuana is it's challenging to really kind of compare it to things that are either innocuous or beneficial, because it's not that, at least in my opinion. There was another
One
question. Yeah,
one
go
more
ahead.
one more question that came in is about the line between enjoying a few drinks with friends after a long day of work and losing control over one's drinking habits, or maybe we could even say substance habits. Sort of, how do we detect where the line is for a friend or a relative in terms of slipping into addiction?
So, you know, on a technical level, we call it the use versus misuse dichotomy, that there is substance use and there's substance misuse. You know, drinking too much, smoking too much marijuana, doing, you know, shopping too much, eating too much, right? This is all misuse, right? It's not giving us what we want out of it. Now, the truth of the matter is, especially with alcohol, which is probably one of the more common, you know, scenarios that you would find with an issue like that, we really don't need as much alcohol as we consume to get what we want out of it. The actual euphoric feeling that we actually get a high from, most people get a high from drinking alcohol. The average person experiences the good feeling from alcohol for 4 minutes, and that's it. And there's no amount of alcohol you can drink for the remainder of the night or the day or the week until you sober up, where you can recreate that feeling. So everything else is just making it worse. That's it. And it doesn't take a lot of alcohol to get to that point. It's a very short-lived experience. So the lower the amount and the slower you go with it is typically better. So right off the bat, most people are already misusing alcohol to begin with. And it's really not hard to tell. Like, I mean, that was an extreme example with that guy I was sitting across from in Israel. But if you get the inkling that this person is drinking too much or drinking too frequently, you're probably right. It's probably not a mistake, right? It's really not a great mystery. There's not some nuance that you really have to have an expertise in, right? If this person is drinking too much, you're probably right. Now, the flip side is my father thinks I'm an alcoholic because, I'll have more than one l'chaim in one sitting. He'll accuse me of that because he never drinks that much. And, truth of the matter is, maybe he's right on some level. I don't think I'm an alcoholic, but I certainly wouldn't self-diagnose. It's not a good behavior for a therapist. But we see it, right? There are parties we go to where people drink a tremendous number of drinks, and that's alcohol abuse, let's say, even in that case. Now, in any one scenario, it's hard to say that that's a continuing issue, right? So you have to pay attention, right? Maybe checking in with that person afterwards, like, wow, you're really going at it. You put back a lot. Yeah, everything okay? Like, was something going on? Did you really feel the need? You might get somewhere with that. I remember I had a madrich in yeshiva when I was in yeshiva my second year, he was trying to get into the shidduch dating world and the Haredi community. He had graduated from Flatbush Yeshiva, so he was a very modern Orthodox person, and he was having failure after failure, and he would come back and drink 3 bottles of wine, 4 bottles of wine in one night. And we were pretty close to talking to the rebbeim there and saying, like, we're really nervous about him because he's just getting absolutely plastered every time he comes back from a bad date, and it doesn't seem to be stopping. Right, the first time around, maybe it was just a really bad experience, but at that point he was really self-medicating, and we could see it even with our naivete. So yeah, you can drink and you'll be fine. Right? You can drink a lot and frequently, and you might be able to walk away from it, right? But there's no one on this planet that can tell you where that line is and where you can cross it. So what might serve us better is teaching people how to drink, right? Teaching people that drinking it faster and drinking more quantities is not going to get you the same experience, and maybe lesser experience than drinking slower and learning how to appreciate what you're drinking, if that's what you really want to do, if that's your choice, right? So it's there is room for use, and I think the prohibition is a good example of just the likelihood that we're never going to be able to say that this is not something that's part of our, and at least in our lifetimes, right? That this is not part of our society. You're going to have a very hard time saying that. So we need to adapt accordingly to that. That they're going to be people who drink, and so you need to figure out how we can communicate to these people what healthy drinking looks like, or what reasonable drinking looks like, and what that means for them and what that means for other people. And so there's more education that's needed. Another question is other places in the world. Yes, there are so many other places in the world that do a much better job with substance use. Any country in Europe or Western Europe, let's say, maybe with the exception of England, just Great Britain in general, they're pretty heavy drinkers over there. But there are countries where store businesses will have signage out front where if someone is struggling with addiction or mental health, they can walk into that business. It might be a bookstore, it might be a coffee shop, it might be some other business, and they can say, I need help. And that person will contact someone, and they will be picked up and they will be brought to a treatment facility. Crazy idea, right? That you can ask another human being for help and they'll find someone who can help you. This is like beyond innovative, and it's something that the United States will never do because there'll be an insurance code problem. Like, who's going to pay for that? How are we going to figure out, who makes the money off of that? Are we charging money for these people to walk into the store, right? Who's going to pay for that? That ambulance ride is going to be thousands of dollars. Does this person have medical coverage? Probably not, because they are struggling with addiction. They lost their job and they lost their benefits, right? So now if they want to get help, it's going to be even more expensive than just continuing to medicate themselves with drugs. So there's, like I said with Gabor Mate, there's clean injection sites. These people are going to use opiates if they don't get treatment, right? They're going to relapse. They have suffered. I mean, I can't emphasize enough that if you're going to read any book on addiction, you have to read his book. It's the first book you need to read. And I'll post a picture of what that is. Maybe I'll do it right now. But, you know, half the time he, you know, will administer the heroin for these people. This is a doctor who's administering drugs for people because he knows this is a safer way for them to do it than to go to try to steal to get the money for it, or, you know, do something even worse to try to get those drugs, which they will. So we just don't have good treatment models yet. And there are other places that are trying things out that are having better success, or at least not causing as much damage as what it is, because none of these people that are engaged in this want to be stealing from their families. None of these people that are engaged in this want to be losing their jobs and leaving their children and doing all these things that, you know, after the fact they feel so ashamed of. They don't want to be doing it. I don't think anyone wants to do it, but that's how bad the addiction is. So this is his book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Gabor Mate. It is, you know, it's a very heavy read. It's not an easy read at times. It's pretty graphic in detail of what people's life experiences are like. But it is by far the best thing I've read on addiction, without exception. You know, you can't turn a page without wanting to underline things and you know, remember quotes and look up sources for that, because it's really you know, it's such a important work.
Ruby, there is so much more, and you have given us so much already. And we're so appreciative of you sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and your insight with such a calm and collected and just knowledgeable style. We're really fortunate here in the Shoal and in Sharon to have your presence and your guidance on these issues. And really just thank you for doing what you do in such a sensitive and menschlich kind of way. And if people want to follow up with Ruby, he's available offline and private. And we'll be, you know, posting this talk on our YouTube channel, so others will be able to benefit from it as well. And I'll wish everyone an Erev Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov, and thank you again, Ruby, for being our teacher and guide. And I'm gonna just stop the recording, but those who want to stay on are welcome to talk and to chat longer.
Yes, thank you all for staying awake. That was quite a feat. Thank you to